How the Taylor murder became a story before it became history. The murder of William Desmond Taylor did not wait for investigation to become narrative. Almost immediately, it was transformed into something more pliable than evidence. Before the facts had been stabilized, before the crime scene had been properly secured, the killing entered the public imagination as a Hollywood story rather than a homicide. This shift happened quickly and deliberately, driven by the same forces that had reason to fear what an unfiltered investigation might reveal. Early press coverage treated Taylor's death as sensational, but curiously abstract. Headlines emphasized scandal, implication, and atmosphere rather than mechanics. The focus drifted toward the idea of Hollywood excess, toward whispers of moral decay, toward the shock that such a thing could happen in the film capital of the world. What was largely absent was a sustained focus on who had access, who had motive, and who benefited from silence. The murder was framed as an event, not an act. This framing mattered. Once a crime is understood primarily as a symbol, it becomes resistant to resolution. Symbols are interpreted, not solved. From the beginning, Taylor's death was discussed less as a killing and more as a reflection of Hollywood itself, as though the industry were both the victim and the perpetrator. That rhetorical move diffused responsibility. If everyone is implicated, no one is accountable. As years passed, this tendency intensified. Retellings emphasized mystery over method. Taylor was described as enigmatic, charming, unknowable. His killer was described as lost to time, swallowed by the chaos of the era. These descriptions were not neutral. They encouraged the idea that clarity had never been possible, that the case was doomed to ambiguity from the start. What was lost in this transformation was proportion. The murder of William Desmond Taylor was not unusually complex. It involved a single victim, a confined location, and a limited pool of suspects. What made it appear unsolvable was not the absence of evidence, but the accumulation of stories layered on top of that evidence until it became difficult to see clearly. By the mid-20th century, a murder had fully entered the realm of cultural myth. Articles revisited it not to advance understanding, but to marvel at its endurance. Books framed it as a puzzle box, inviting readers to enjoy speculation without expectation of resolution. Each retelling added texture, but removed urgency. The murder became something to contemplate rather than confront. This is how crimes survive indefinitely. They are converted into lore. Once that happens, asking what actually occurred feels almost rude, as though it disrupts a tradition. The Taylor murder became less about a man who was killed and more about a story people enjoyed retelling, each version reinforcing the idea that the truth was forever out of reach. This episode begins by rejecting that premise. Before William Desmond Taylor became a symbol, he was a person who was shot in his own home by someone who knew him. That reality was never as elusive as later portrayals suggest. It was obscured, not erased. To understand what really happened, the mythology has to be stripped away first, layer by layer, until only behavior, access, and consequence remain. That work begins here. Section 2. The press, the panic, and the shape of the first narrative. In the days immediately following William Desmond Taylor's murder, the press did not wait for confirmation before constructing meaning. Newspapers filled the vacuum left by an incomplete investigation with implication, innuendo, and moral framing. This was not unusual for the era, but the speed and intensity with which the story hardened was remarkable. Within a week, the public was already being trained on how to think about the crime. Early reporting oscillated between two incompatible impulses. On one hand, Taylor was portrayed as a respectable figure, a gentleman director whose death was shocking and tragic. On the other, his murder was framed as proof of Hollywood's corruption, another symptom of an industry supposedly rotting from excess. This contradiction was not resolved because it did not need to be. Both framings distracted from the same thing, the mechanics of the killing itself. Details that should have prompted scrutiny were treated as curiosities. The lack of forced entry, the missing personal papers, the quiet nature of the shooting. These facts appeared in print, but rarely stayed in focus. Instead, reporters gravitated toward atmosphere. They wrote about young actresses, late-night visits, whispered secrets, and moral danger. The bungalow became a stage set rather than a crime scene. This approach served multiple purposes. it sold papers. It fed existing public anxiety about Hollywood, and it subtly shifted responsibility away from specific individuals and toward a generalized sense of decadence. If the crime was a product of an immoral environment, then no single person needed to be held accountable. The studios understood this immediately. Public statements emphasized shock and sorrow while allowing the press to speculate freely in directions that did not threaten powerful interests. Names were floated and then quietly withdrawn. Narratives were suggested and then allowed to burn out. What was never encouraged was sustained attention on access, motive, and post-crime behavior. As weeks passed, the press coverage began to resemble serialization. New angles emerged not because new evidence had surfaced, but because novelty was required to keep the story alive. Each article added color while subtracting clarity. The murder became a rolling spectacle rather than an investigative process. This period is crucial because it established the tone for everything that followed. By the time official inquiries slowed, the public already believed the case was too tangled to resolve. Contradictions were not alarming. They were expected. Confusion became part of the story's appeal. The press did not invent uncertainty, but it normalized it. By repeating unresolved questions without demanding answers, newspapers trained readers to accept ambiguity as the natural state of the case. That acceptance would prove remarkably durable. What began as reporting quickly became myth-making, not through outright fabrication, but through emphasis and omission. The same details were repeated until they felt familiar, while other details were allowed to fade. Over time, the absence of resolution came to feel like evidence itself, proof that the truth had somehow evaporated. This framing laid the groundwork for everything that followed. Taylorology, dramatizations, amateur sleuthing, and endless reinterpretation all rest on the assumption first taught by the press, that the murder of William Desmond Taylor was inherently unknowable. It was not. It was simply buried beneath a narrative that made asking the right questions feel beside the point. Section 3. Taylorology, the zine, and the professionalization of obsession. Taylorology did not emerge only as an abstract tendency. It became a concrete object, a zine, a self-consciously serious publication devoted entirely to the murder of William Desmond Taylor. What began as an effort to preserve research and share findings gradually evolved into something more influential and more complicated. Taylorology, the zine, helped define how the case would be discussed for decades. At its best, the zine represented a corrective impulse. Its contributors were dissatisfied with shallow press accounts and dismissive studio histories. They wanted to gather documents, timelines, and forgotten testimony. They treated the murder as worthy of sustained attention rather than occasional nostalgia. In this sense, Taylorology performed a necessary archival function at a moment when institutional memory had largely failed. But the format also shaped the content. Because Taylorology was ongoing rather than finite, it encouraged perpetual reinterpretation. Each issue needed something new. New angles were prized over resolution. Fresh speculation became as valuable as recovered evidence. Over time, the act of contribution itself became part of the appeal. The zine created a community bound by fascination rather than conclusion. Readers were not guided toward probability. They were invited into an ever-expanding conversation. The murder became less a historical event and more a shared intellectual terrain. This shift subtly altered the stakes. Solving the crime would have ended the project. Keeping it open kept it alive. Taylorology also reinforced a particular tone. Contributors often wrote with caution, framing assertions as possibilities rather than judgments. This was partly ethical and partly practical. But the cumulative effect was dilution. Strong patterns were softened by endless qualifiers. Responsibility became distributed across scenarios rather than located in behavior. One of the most consequential effects of the zine was its influence on later writers. Many books and documentaries drew directly or indirectly from Taylorology. The zine's approach became the default posture for discussing the case. Serious but non-committal. Detailed but inconclusive. Engaged but hesitant. This posture normalized the idea that certainty was inappropriate. Readers learned that to take a firm position was to be reckless or naive. The safest stance was perpetual inquiry. The most respectable conclusion was no conclusion at all. Taylorology also contributed to a flattening of hierarchy among sources. Primary evidence, rumor, and later interpretation often appeared side by side. Over time, repetition gave weight to ideas regardless of their origin. A theory mentioned often enough began to feel established, even if it rested on little more than inference. This does not diminish the dedication of those involved. Many contributors did important work preserving fragments that might otherwise have been lost. But preservation is not the same as judgment. Archiving without synthesis leaves interpretation suspended. The zine did not cause the Taylor case to remain unresolved, but it helped shape a culture in which irresolution was not only accepted, but rewarded. Each new issue reinforced the idea that the mystery itself was the point. This episode challenges that assumption. Respecting history does not require endless deferral. At some point, evidence demands prioritization. Patterns demand acknowledgement, and fascination must give way to conclusion. Taylorology the zine kept the case alive. It also kept it frozen. Section 4, Cast of Killers and the Appeal of the Inspired Outsider. Among all modern retellings of the William Desmond Taylor murder, none has been as influential as Cast of Killers. Sidney D. Kirkpatrick's book did not simply revisit the case, it reframed it, by placing director King Vidor at the center as a kind of unofficial investigator. The book transformed the murder from a story about institutional failure into a narrative about individual insight. This framing was powerful. Vidor was not a police officer. He was not bound by procedure. He was a filmmaker, an insider with access, memory, and curiosity. The idea that someone like Vidor could solve what authorities could not is deeply appealing. It suggests that truth survives in fragments, waiting for the right mind to assemble them. But this appeal comes at a cost. By centering the story on Vidor's personal quest, Cast of Killers shifts attention away from the forces that ensured the case would never be properly resolved. The murder becomes a puzzle that failed because no one clever enough tried hard enough, rather than a crime neutralized by power, money, and early interference. King Vidor did investigate informally. He spoke to people, he gathered impressions, he formed conclusions. But he was also working decades after the fact, long after evidence had been lost. Stories had hardened, and participants had died. His role was interpretive, not evidentiary. Treating his conclusions as a near solution risks confusing narrative satisfaction with historical rigor. The book's structure reinforces this confusion. Clues are presented dramatically. Revelations arrive through conversation and recollection. The reader is invited to share in discovery. This is effective storytelling, but it subtly recasts the murder as something solvable through insight alone. What disappears in this framing is accountability. Institutions fade into the background. The compromised crime scene becomes a regrettable footnote. Studio interference becomes atmosphere rather than obstruction. The emphasis rests on what might have been known, not on why it was allowed to remain unprosecuted. Cast of Killers also helped cement a particular tone around the Taylor case. Serious, informed but cautious, engaged but unwilling to land firmly. The book gestures toward conclusions without fully committing to them. This restraint is often praised as responsible. It is also convenient. By stopping short of a definitive reconstruction, the book aligns with the broader culture of Taylorology. It keeps the case alive as an intellectual exercise rather than a moral one. Readers are encouraged to admire the complexity rather than confront the implications. The figure of King Vidor as detective is central to this effect. He represents the idea that the truth exists but remains just out of reach, glimpsed through memory and implication. This image is compelling, but it reinforces the notion that certainty is inappropriate or impossible. In reality, the limitations Vidor faced were not intellectual, they were structural. No amount of insight could restore missing evidence or overcome the protection afforded to certain individuals. The problem was never that no one was looking. It was that looking was allowed only so far. Cast of Killers deserves credit for renewing interest in the case and preserving valuable testimony. But it also helped popularize a framing that prioritizes narrative elegance over prosecutorial clarity. The Taylor murder does not need another inspired outsider to make sense of it. It needs the mythology cleared away so evidence can be weighed without romance. That clearing begins next. Section 5. How retellings learn to look away. By the time the murder of William Desmond Taylor entered its second and third generations of retelling, a recognizable pattern had fully set in. No matter the medium, the stated seriousness of the work, or the credentials of the author, the narrative consistently bent away from responsibility. Books, films, documentaries, and long essays repeated the same maneuver with remarkable discipline. They lingered on atmosphere, social context, and implication, but retreated at the precise moment where evidence demanded a conclusion. This retreat was not accidental. It reflected an unspoken rule that governs much historical storytelling, particularly when the subject intersects with beloved cultural institutions. Definitive claims invite challenge. Ambiguity invites praise. A story that ends without judgment can be revisited indefinitely without requiring the teller to take a moral or analytical position. Over time, that posture becomes mistaken for seriousness. In portrayals of the Taylor murder, this strategy appeared again and again. Suspects were introduced carefully, each given narrative space and emotional shading. Evidence was presented and immediately softened. Assertions were paired with caveats. The audience was trained to treat every fact as provisional and every pattern as coincidence. By the end, irresolution felt not like failure, but like intellectual restraint. The cost of this posture was clarity. When no explanation was allowed to dominate, probability disappeared. Strong indicators were flattened alongside weak ones. Access was weighed equally with speculation. Behavior was treated as interchangeable with rumor. The crime dissolved into mood rather than mechanism, into tone rather than consequence. Media portrayals also tended to aestheticize the violence itself. Taylor's bungalow became a cinematic interior. His death became a symbolic rupture rather than a physical act. The focus shifted from what was done to him to what his death represented for Hollywood. In this framing, the industry became the injured party, wounded by scandal, forced into premature self-reflection. What receded was the simple fact that someone entered Taylor's home and killed him, quietly, intentionally, then removed evidence and left without detection. This avoidance of mechanics was revealing. Mechanics implicate individuals. Atmosphere implicates eras. It is easier to blame a moment in history than a person. It is easier to discuss morality in the abstract than access in the specific. It is easier to present a rotating gallery of suspects than to narrow responsibility. Over time, this tendency became self-reinforcing. Each new retelling inherited the caution of the last. Audiences learned what to expect: mystery, elegance, no answer. The case became familiar not for its facts, but for its refusal to resolve. This is where most accounts stop. They gesture toward uncertainty and invite the listener to decide. That invitation feels fair. It feels democratic. It is also evasive. At some point, the refusal to conclude becomes its own distortion. Evidence is finite. Possibilities are not endless. History does not require permanent suspension. This episode exists to end that suspension. What follows is not another interpretation among many. It is a reconstruction grounded in access, timing, behavior, and consequence. It is an attempt to answer the question that a century of retellings has learned to avoid. What actually happened to William Desmond Taylor? The mythology ends here. The persistence of this pattern has consequences beyond storytelling. It shapes scholarship, public memory, and the limits of acceptable conclusion. When ambiguity is treated as virtue, certainty becomes suspect by default. Writers who attempt to rank evidence or privilege certain behaviors over others are framed as reckless, even when their conclusions rest on careful synthesis rather than speculation. This creates a feedback loop where caution is rewarded and decisiveness is discouraged. In the Taylor case, this loop has been particularly durable because so many early failures were allowed to harden into precedent. The compromised crime scene, the missing documents, and the silenced witnesses were transformed into proof that the case could never be known, rather than evidence of why it was never resolved. Each retelling inherited those failures and treated them as natural conditions rather than outcomes of human choice. As a result, the audience was trained to expect that any attempt at resolution was an act of overreach. The safest move was to admire complexity and retreat. That retreat became tradition, it became style, and eventually it became doctrine. This doctrine did not arise from evidence. It arose from repetition, deference, and a long-standing unwillingness to say what patterns plainly indicate when they are allowed to speak, clearly and without apology. And now. Section 6. What we think really happened. Once the mythology is stripped away, the murder of William Desmond Taylor stops behaving like an endless puzzle and starts behaving like a constrained event. This was not a crime with unlimited variables. It took place in a fixed location, within a narrow window of time, involving a man whose personal world was small, curated, and deeply entangled. Those constraints matter, because they sharply limit what could plausibly have happened. Taylor was killed inside his own bungalow. There was no forced entry. Doors were not broken. Windows were not shattered. Furniture was not overturned. Neighbors did not report shouting or disturbance. Whoever entered that space did so calmly and without resistance. That alone eliminates random violence, burglary gone wrong, and most outsider theories. A stranger does not gain silent access to a private home and leave without trace. The killing itself was controlled. Taylor was shot once with a small caliber firearm. There was no evidence of multiple shots, prolonged struggle, or chaotic violence. A single fatal wound suggests intent rather than panic. This was not an act of rage spiraling out of control. It was a decision executed at close range. The absence of the weapon is critical. Firearms do not vanish accidentally. Someone removed it. That action occurred after the killing and required enough composure to recognize the importance of eliminating the most obvious piece of evidence. This tells us the killer was not overwhelmed or disoriented. They were thinking ahead. Equally important is what else disappeared. Taylor's valuables remained. Furniture, cash, and easily removable items were untouched. What vanished were papers, letters, and personal documents. These items had no resale value. They mattered only to someone who understood their contents and feared their existence. That kind of selective removal requires familiarity. This was not theft. It was containment. Taylor's life supplies motive for containment. He was a man who listened, advised, mentored, and intervened. His private world included people who depended on him emotionally, professionally, or financially. And dependence breeds entitlement. A person who believes they have a claim on Taylor's attention can become volatile when that claim is threatened. In that context, letters are not souvenirs. They are leverage, liability, and proof. The timeline reinforces this interpretation. Taylor was last seen alive, greeting a visitor at his door. That visitor was never identified with certainty. Shortly afterward, Taylor was dead. The shooting was quiet enough, and the response was disorganized enough that his death was initially misclassified. That misclassification bought time. Time allowed confusion. Confusion protected the killer. When the body was discovered, the investigation was immediately compromised. Too many people entered the bungalow. Too many objects were handled. Too many decisions were made with public relations in mind. But that chaos did not cause the crime. It preserved it. By the time police began asking serious questions, the scene no longer spoke clearly. What remains is a narrowing field of probability. The killer was someone Taylor trusted or tolerated, someone who knew his routines, someone who understood which papers mattered and where they might be kept, someone who could leave the scene without drawing attention and then watch the story be reframed as scandal rather than homicide. This reconstruction does not rely on rumor. It relies on behavior that matches the physical facts. Who had access? Who had motive? Who had opportunity? Who had the presence of mind to remove a gun and targeted documents? When those questions are asked honestly, the case stops expanding into endless theories and collapses inward toward a coherent explanation. Two details sharpen the profile. First, the missing wallet and target papers point to knowledge, not impulse. A burglar takes valuables fast. A familiar visitor takes items that explain the relationship and control the story later. Second, The lack of immediate alarm suggests the killer believed the aftermath could be managed. That confidence fits someone who expected deference, feared exposure, or both. In Hollywood, reputation can function like armor, and the killer acted as if delay and confusion would protect them. Notice what this scenario does not require. It does not require a masked intruder, a chase, or an elaborate cover story. It requires only a relationship under strain, a private meeting, a gun within reach, and a rapid decision to erase what could prove motive. In that light, the case is not unknowable, it is specific. The mystery survives because later storytellers treat possibilities as equal when a scene does not. Next, we narrow further and show why the evidence converges instead of competing, and why only one scenario accounts for every known fact without distortion. Section 7. Why the evidence converges instead of competing. One of the most persistent myths surrounding the murder of William Desmond Taylor is that the evidence points in too many directions to allow clarity. This belief has been repeated so often that it has hardened into assumption. But when the evidence is examined as behavior rather than as story, it does not scatter. It converges. Convergence begins with access. Taylor was not an isolated figure with an open door to the world. His private life was tightly managed. He lived alone. He kept regular habits. He admitted people selectively. Anyone who entered his bungalow without resistance did so because Taylor allowed it. That fact alone collapses a wide range of speculative suspects and scenarios. Next comes timing. Taylor was killed within a narrow window after greeting a visitor. There is no evidence of multiple visitors, no sign of prolonged socializing, and no indication of interruption. The killing occurred quickly, privately, and without escalation. That timeline favors someone who arrived with purpose rather than chance. Then there is behavior after the act. The removal of the weapon is not merely suspicious, it is decisive. It indicates foresight, not shock. Likewise, the selective removal of papers and personal items indicates knowledge of their importance. These choices align with a person who understood what would matter later, not someone improvising under pressure. When analysts treat each of these elements separately, they can appear ambiguous. Access alone does not prove guilt. Timing alone does not assign motive. Missing items alone do not identify a suspect. But evidence is not meant to be evaluated in isolation. It gains meaning through accumulation. What emerges when these elements are considered together is a consistent profile. The killer was known to Taylor. The killer had reason to fear exposure. The killer had the composure to remove evidence. The killer believed, correctly, that confusion and delay would work in their favor. Contrast this with alternative explanations. A random intruder does not know which papers to take. A burglar does not leave valuables behind. A panicked attacker does not remove a weapon cleanly. A stranger does not count on institutional hesitation to protect them. Each alternative requires additional assumptions to survive. Converging evidence reduces the need for invention. The more assumptions a theory requires, the weaker it becomes. The strongest explanations are those that account for all known facts without distortion or exception. In the Taylor case, only a narrow set of scenarios meets that standard. Another point of convergence lies in silence. Key figures withheld information, statements shifted, alibis softened. These behaviors did not occur randomly. They clustered around the same relationships and the same vulnerabilities. Silence followed proximity. Finally, consider outcome. No arrest was made, no prosecution followed. The case drifted into legend. That outcome favors someone shielded by social position, financial resources, or institutional reluctance. It does not favor an expendable outsider. When the evidence is allowed to speak as a whole, it does not tell 10 different stories. It tells one story repeatedly, from different angles. The persistence of competing theories is not a sign of complexity. It is a sign that storytellers have treated equivalence as fairness. Fairness is not the same as accuracy. In the next section, we will address the final obstacle to resolution: why prosecution never happened, even as the case narrowed, and how power transformed convergence into paralysis. Section 8. Why prosecution never happened. When the evidence surrounding the murder of William Desmond Taylor is allowed to converge rather than disperse, it does not form a cloud of equal possibilities. It narrows, repeatedly, and at the center of that narrowing stands Charlotte Shelby. The failure to prosecute her was not the result of investigative confusion. It was the result of institutional reluctance to confront the consequences of naming her. Shelby was not a peripheral figure who happened to cross Taylor's path. She was deeply entangled in his private life through her daughter, Mary Miles Minter. Taylor was emotionally close to Minter, served as a mentor, and was involved in guiding her career. Shelby viewed this relationship as a threat to her control. Multiple witnesses described her hostility toward Taylor long before his death. This hostility was not subtle. It was expressed openly, repeatedly, and without embarrassment. Access is the first point of convergence. Shelby knew where Taylor lived. She was familiar with his routines. She could approach him without raising alarm. Taylor admitted visitors selectively, and Shelby fell well within that circle. There is no evidence of forced entry because none would have been necessary. Motive is the second point of convergence. Shelby had a clear interest in controlling her daughter's relationships, reputation, and career. Taylor represented independence for Minter, and independence threatened Shelby's authority. Letters later recovered demonstrated emotional intensity and attachment that Shelby would have found intolerable. Removing Taylor removed the problem. Means is the third. Shelby owned firearms consistent with the weapon used in the killing. This fact is not ambiguous. It was known at the time. It should have triggered aggressive scrutiny. Instead, it was handled delicately, as though asking too many questions would be impolite. Behavior after the murder reinforces the pattern. Shelby's statements shifted. Her cooperation was selective. Her alibi was never fully secured. She displayed confidence rather than fear. This is not the behavior of someone worried about being wrongly accused. It is the behavior of someone accustomed to control and accustomed to being deferred to. So why was she never charged? The answer is not mystery. It is consequence. Charlotte Shelby was wealthy, socially connected, and legally aggressive. Prosecuting her would have implicated Paramount, destabilized a major star, and intensified scrutiny on an industry already under attack. Law enforcement and prosecutors did not lack suspicion. They lacked appetite. Delay became the solution. Delay allowed evidence to degrade. Delay allowed witnesses to soften or disappear. Delay allowed alternative suspects to soak up attention. By the time the case was cold enough to be described as unsolvable, the decision not to prosecute could be framed as inevitability rather than choice. Other suspects functioned as pressure valves. Edward Sands was conveniently absent. Mary Miles Minter was young, emotional, and already scandalized. These figures absorbed speculation while Shelby remained insulated. This was not accidental, it was useful. When historians later describe the case as unresolved, they often confuse legal outcome with factual clarity. No indictment does not mean no answer. It means no will. Charlotte Shelby was not protected by secrecy alone. She was protected by a system that instinctively avoids prosecuting women of wealth when doing so would fracture powerful institutions. That instinct was stronger than evidence. The failure to prosecute Shelby was not a miscarriage of justice caused by confusion. It was a conscious retreat shaped by fear of consequence. In the final section, we will examine what this retreat taught Hollywood, how it shaped the handling of future scandals, and why the legacy of William Desmond Taylor's murder still matters today. Section 9. What the Taylor murder taught Hollywood. The murder of William Desmond Taylor did not end with a body on a bungalow floor. Its true impact unfolded afterward, in the choices made by studios, police, journalists, and cultural institutions. The lesson Hollywood absorbed was not how to prevent violence, it was how to survive it. The failure to prosecute Charlotte Shelby sent a message that traveled far beyond this single case. It demonstrated that when scandal threatens power, delay is a viable strategy. Confusion can be cultivated. Silence can be reframed as dignity. Over time, even the most pointed evidence can be softened into ambiguity. Hollywood learned that narrative control was as important as legal defense. From this point forward, scandals would be managed not by transparency, but by reframing. Crimes became tragedies. Responsibility became complexity. Individuals dissolved into atmospheres. This was not accidental. It was adaptive behavior learned under pressure. The Taylor murder arrived at a moment when the film industry was already under siege. The Roscoe Arbuckle trials had shaken public confidence. Moral reformers were watching closely. Another conviction tied directly to Hollywood elites could have triggered regulation, censorship, or financial collapse. Containment was not merely self-interest, it was survival. This case also revealed which figures were expendable and which were not. Edward Sands could be blamed because he was absent and powerless. Mary Miles Minter could be publicly ruined because she was young and already vulnerable. Charlotte Shelby could not be touched because she represented money, influence, and legal retaliation. The system sorted risk accordingly and acted with quiet efficiency. These dynamics did not end in 1922. They became embedded. Over the following decades, Hollywood repeatedly applied the same playbook: delay, denial, reframing, elevating mystery over accountability. The industry learned that time itself could be weaponized. Public outrage fades, evidence degrades, stories replace facts. The cultural afterlife of the Taylor murder reinforced this lesson. As the case became legend, its unresolved status was treated as romantic rather than alarming. The absence of justice was reframed as intellectual intrigue. The industry benefited from this transformation. A murder that becomes a puzzle no longer demands consequence. This transformation shaped scholarship as well as entertainment. Writers learned that certainty invited backlash, while ambiguity invited praise. Researchers learned to hedge. Documentarians learned to balance rather than conclude. The safest posture was suspension. The most rewarded voice was the one that refused to decide. This is why the legacy of the Taylor case matters. It marks the moment Hollywood learned how to absorb a killing without changing its behavior. It showed that reputation could outlast evidence, and that power could wait out truth with patience and confidence. The cost of this lesson was borne by the victim. William Desmond Taylor became less a man who was killed and more a symbol that could be endlessly repurposed. His life was flattened into anecdote. His death was aestheticized. Accountability was deferred indefinitely. This pattern echoes through later cases, when investigators hesitate, when press coverage softens, when powerful figures are described as complicated rather than culpable. These are not coincidences. They are inherited behaviors, refined and repeated. The murder of William Desmond Taylor taught Hollywood that justice was optional if the right people were protected. It taught that silence could be framed as grace and delay as prudence. It taught that the story could be shaped until the truth no longer threatened anyone who mattered. This is the legacy we inherit when myth replaces history. It is not elegant. It is not mysterious. It is functional. And it is why this case still demands resolution, not as legend, but as record. Re-examining this case is therefore not an act of nostalgia or provocation. It is an act of correction. The record shows how institutions behave when the cost of truth exceeds the cost of silence. It shows how easily a crime can be reframed into culture and how culture can anesthetize outrage. When people ask why the Taylor murder still matters, the answer is simple. It matters because the mechanisms that buried it remain intact. They function quietly, predictably, and effectively. They reward caution, punish clarity, and elevate ambiguity as virtue. Until those mechanisms are confronted directly, the pattern they produce will continue, and justice will remain conditional, granted only when it is convenient, rather than when it is deserved. That condition, learned here, has shaped a century of response to power and violence in entertainment, law, and memory alike. And it is why this story refuses to stay buried even now. It still speaks, plainly, still. Section 10. Why William Desmond Taylor Still Matters. William Desmond Taylor's murder has endured not because it is unknowable, but because it is uncomfortable. It sits at the intersection of violence, power, and institutional self-protection. To resolve it fully requires acknowledging not only who likely pulled the trigger, but why so many people were willing to look away afterward. Taylor himself has often been reduced to a role in this story: the victim, the gentleman director, the man with secrets. In reality, he was a working professional navigating an industry that demanded discretion while quietly exploiting it. He was trusted because he listened. He was vulnerable because he listened. That vulnerability proved fatal. The conclusion of this investigation is not that Hollywood failed once. It is that Hollywood learned. It learned that scandal could be managed through delay, diffusion, and narrative substitution. It learned that justice could be deferred indefinitely if enough uncertainty was cultivated. It learned that power did not need to erase truth, only to surround it with noise. Charlotte Shelby's avoidance of prosecution was not an anomaly. It was an early demonstration of how wealth, influence, and fear of consequence combined to paralyze accountability. The system did not need to conspire. It only needed to hesitate. That hesitation did the rest. What makes the Taylor case instructive is how clearly the pattern reveals itself in retrospect. Access was known. Motive was visible. Means were available. Behavior aligned. Silence followed. Delay hardened into legend. The result was not mystery, but permission. Permission for institutions to repeat the same choices in future crises. This is why the case resists closure in the cultural imagination. It is not just about a man who was killed. It is about how easily a killing can be absorbed and normalized when the right interests are at stake. That realization is more disturbing than any unsolved riddle. Resolving the Taylor murder as history rather than myth does not undo the harm, but it does something essential. It restores proportion. It places responsibility where it belongs. It rejects the idea that ambiguity is inherently virtuous. True crime often promises revelation. This investigation offers something different. It offers recognition. Recognition of how systems behave when tested. Recognition of how stories are shaped to protect power. Recognition that justice fails not only through corruption, but through caution. William Desmond Taylor deserves to be remembered not as a puzzle, but as a warning. His death marks a moment when Hollywood discovered how to survive accountability, and in doing so, set a precedent that echoes through later decades. This trilogy began by examining a life, moved through evidence and suspects, and ended with legacy. The through line is simple. Violence followed by silence creates permission. Permission creates repetition. Ending this story requires saying what previous generations hesitated to say. The evidence converges. The avoidance was deliberate. The legacy is real. That final point matters because the patterns identified here are not relics of the silent era. They recur whenever institutions fear exposure more than injustice. When investigators hesitate, when journalists soften language, when reputations are weighed against lives. These behaviors did not vanish with studio bosses and press agents. They adapted. What makes historical cases like Taylor's valuable is not spectacle, it is clarity. Distance strips away excuses. With time, the motivations that once seemed delicate or dangerous can be named plainly. Doing so is not cruelty, it is accuracy. This episode does not ask the listener to relish certainty. It asks the listener to accept responsibility as a historical category. At some point, refusing to decide becomes a decision itself. In the Taylor case, that refusal shaped an industry. Remembering William Desmond Taylor accurately is not about reopening wounds. It is about refusing to let silence masquerade as sophistication. It is about understanding how easily justice can be paused until it expires. That lesson, learned early, still governs how power responds to harm. It is why this case remains relevant. It is why it demands conclusion, and it is why stories like this must be told with discipline rather than deference. We end this investigation not with mystery, but with recognition. Recognition that history can be corrected. Recognition that patterns can be named. Recognition that accountability, even delayed, still matters. This is AI true crime. The intelligence is artificial, but the crime is real.